I remember the tremor in my hands, hidden beneath the crisp white tablecloth that night in the opulent New York City restaurant. He, Lysander Thorne, the man who owned half the skyline and treated me like part of the furniture, had brought me to a business dinner, an invisible prop. But then he asked a patronizing question, expecting silence. Instead, I opened my mouth, and the words that came out didn't just surprise him. They ripped through the polite facade of the room, exposing everything. The gasp, the frozen faces, the sudden, deafening silence. That was just the beginning. Have you ever been in a moment where you knew deep down you had to risk everything to be seen, to be truly heard? Tell me your story in the comments. I'm Diana, and this is the true story of how I found my voice, and in doing so, accidentally shattered a millionaire's world and built my own. Looking back, I can almost pinpoint the exact moment my life veered off its predictable course. It wasn't a grand revelation, but a mundane Tuesday afternoon in a penthouse I cleaned a place that felt both opulent and utterly devoid of warmth. I was Diana Frost, a housekeeper by profession, a quiet observer by nature, and utterly invisible to the world of high finance that Lysander Thorne inhabited. He was the kind of man who built empires, not relationships, and certainly not with the staff who polished his silver. I'd worked for him for nearly 3 years in his sprawling New York City penthouse, a silent fixture in his meticulously ordered chaos. I remember thinking, this is it, Diana. This is your life. Clean, observe, repeat. Little did I know the universe was about to hand me a very different kind of dust rag. My mornings at Lysander's began before most of Midtown Manhattan even thought about coffee. The rising sun would barely kiss the chrome skyscrapers as I slipped through the discreet service entrance of his building, a phantom figure moving through hushed hallways. Lysander's penthouse spanned an entire floor, a testament to his ambition and, frankly, his ego. It was a minimalist marvel, all glass steel and stark white walls meticulously curated down to the last impossibly expensive art piece. My routine was a silent dance polish, the imported marble vacuum, the impossibly plush rugs arranged the precisely placed books on shelves so vast they looked like a small library. Every day was a mirror image of the last, reflecting the pristine, unblemished surface Lysander demanded of his world. I often wondered if he ever truly lived in it, or if it was just another stage for his relentless pursuit of power. Lately, though, even this rigid order had begun to fray at the edges. Lysander, usually an iceberg of composure, had been agitated. His voice, typically a low rumble, now carried a sharp edge, particularly during his frequent hushed phone calls. Crumpled financial reports, once a rare sight, appeared more often in the waste bins, pages filled with numbers that even to my untrained eye looked less than stellar. I'd catch him pacing late into the night, the faint glow of his study lamp casting a long shadow under his door, a rare crack in his impenetrable facade. Even Bethany, his perpetually unflappable assistant, seemed to move with a new, almost frantic urgency whenever she entered or left his inner sanctum. The air in the penthouse crackled with an unspoken urgency, a tension so thick you could almost taste it like static before a storm. I knew from the hushed tones of Bethany's whispers about investor confidence and market instability that something big, something bad was brewing for Thorne Industries. I was in his vast, almost empty home office that Tuesday afternoon, carefully aligning a stack of first edition novels, each spine perfectly perpendicular, as was his precise command. The only sound was the faint hum of the city filtering through the triple-pane glass and the almost imperceptible click of my careful movements. That's when his voice, sharp and startling, sliced through the quiet. Frost. I nearly dropped a signed copy of a rare classic. He never addressed me directly, not usually. It was always through Bethany or a terse note left on the counter. I turned my heart, giving an involuntary thump against my ribs to see him standing framed in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the panoramic city view. He looked harried, his tie slightly askew, a vein throbbing faintly at his temple. "Yes, Mr. Thorne." I said, my voice as neutral as I could make it. He didn't invite. He instructed, his tone abrupt, almost dismissive, as if I were an inanimate object he'd just noticed. I need you to accompany me to a dinner tonight. Important investors. No time to find anyone suitable. He waved a dismissive hand, not quite looking at me. Just be there, and don't speak unless spoken to. Understood. I was stunned. My mind raced. Me, to a business dinner with important investors. What in the world could he possibly be thinking? Is this some kind of twisted, elaborate joke? The sheer audacity of it, the utter lack of regard for my position, yet the desperate urgency in his eyes, it was a bizarre cocktail of emotions. I felt a mix of indignant outrage and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of curiosity. This wasn't just an order, it was an anomaly, a rogue asteroid hurtling towards my predictable, neatly ordered existence. My immediate instinct was to politely, firmly refuse. What reason could I possibly have to endure such a charade? But then a deeper, unarticulated impulse, a quiet, almost rebellious whisper surfaced. A desire for something more than this life of cleaning, observing, and repeating. A chance to step, even if just for a few hours, beyond the invisible boundary that separated my world from his. It was absurd, illogical, utterly professional suicide, and yet it called to me. I simply nodded, maintaining my professional composure, masking the whirlwind of questions and nascent excitement swirling inside me. Lysander, already halfway out the door, dismissed me with a terse, "Good, Bethany will send details." He left me standing there, expecting me to simply figure it out, as if I had a wardrobe full of designer gowns and a glam squad on speed dial. I didn't. My resources were limited. I raced back to my small, meticulously organized apartment in Queens. It was cozy, filled with second-hand furniture, and a quiet charm that his penthouse utterly lacked. I rummaged through my closet, my heart hammering a nervous rhythm. My eyes landed on a simple, elegant dress, a deep emerald green bought years ago for a cousin's wedding, an event I'd almost not attended because of work. I never thought I'd wear it again, certainly not in this setting. It wasn't couture, but it was well made and clean. I spent hours meticulously preparing myself. It wasn't for Lysander, not really. It was for me. A silent act of defiance, a quiet declaration of self-respect. I washed and styled my hair with extra care, applied just enough makeup to enhance, not transform. In the mirror, I practiced a serene, unreadable expression, knowing I needed to project an image of calm competence to appear exactly as Lysander had demanded, discreet. But beneath that calm, a different woman was stirring. I didn't have the suitable companion credentials he wanted, but I had something else, an invisible strength honed by years of unnoticed labor and silent observation. That evening, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the simple neckline of my dress, I realized something profound. It wasn't about Lysander Thorne or his ridiculous request, it was about me. For so long I'd been content to be unseen, to blend into the background, but a tiny rebellious spark had ignited. I didn't know what tonight held, what absurd performance I was about to be dragged into, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't just be Frost the housekeeper. I would be Diana stepping into a world that had always been just beyond the glass, and for the first time I felt a strange sense of anticipation, not dread. The city lights began to twinkle outside my window, beckoning me into an unknown night. The ride to the restaurant, a high-end establishment in the heart of Manhattan, was predictably silent. Lysander sat across from me in the luxury sedan, engrossed in his tablet, as if I were merely another piece of the car's upholstery. I remember the knot of nerves in my stomach, not because I was afraid of the investors, but because I was afraid of myself, afraid I'd revert to the silent, invisible Diana. But as we pulled up and the valet opened the door, a different feeling washed over me. It was a sense of stepping onto a stage, and for the first time I felt a strange, quiet power in my own presence. The obsidian, its name, a fitting promise of its exclusivity, loomed before us, a beacon of muted luxury in the bustling concrete jungle of New York City. Its facade was dark, sleek, and utterly uninviting to anyone not on its meticulously curated guest list. As the valet, a young man with practiced efficiency, opened my door, his eyes flickered to my dress, then to Lysander, then back to me, a swift, silent appraisal that spoke volumes. I felt the subtle glances from the restaurant staff as we entered, a collective murmur of curiosity that rippled through the elegant lobby. They recognized Lysander, of course, but my unexpected presence by his side clearly threw them off. I held my head high, ignoring their unspoken questions, focusing instead on the marble floor beneath my sensible heels. Lysander, oblivious to the subtle drama unfolding around us, barely acknowledged my existence, his greeting a curt "let's go," as if he were merely corralling an unnecessary accessory rather than a person. He moved with a singular focus, his gaze fixed on the maitre d', already envisioning the handshake, the power plays the business to be done. I simply followed a silent shadow in his wake, but my senses were alive, absorbing every detail, every hushed whisper. We were led to a prominent table in the heart of the room, strategically positioned for observation, a spotlight on a meticulously crafted scene. 3 powerful figures rose to greet us. First, Cassian Reed, his gaze unnervingly perceptive, his smile polite, but with an undercurrent of genuine curiosity that lingered on me a moment too long. Then, Miss Albright, the formidable board chair, her silver hair pulled back severely, her expression unreadable, a woman who radiated authority without saying a word. Finally, Mr. Sterling, a man whose old money skepticism was almost palpable, his eyes quickly scanning my simple dress before settling on Lysander with an expectant, almost impatient air. Lysander introduced me vaguely, almost as an afterthought, his eyes darting away, as if uncomfortable with the situation he'd created. "This is Diana," he said quickly, his voice flat. "She's accompanying me tonight." He didn't offer my last name, no title, no explanation. Just Diana. I felt the weight of their gazes, their collective scrutiny. Cassian Reed's initial polite smile seemed to deepen slightly, morphing into something genuinely intrigued. Miss Albright's expression remained an enigma, but I sensed a flicker of assessment in her sharp eyes. Mr. Sterling, however, made no effort to mask his dismissiveness. A slight frown creased his brow, and I saw a subtle exchange of glances between him and Miss Albright. The unspoken question hung in the air like an invisible fog. Who is this woman, and why is she here? I met their gazes with a serene composure, a mask I'd perfected over years of quiet observation, allowing nothing of my own internal turbulence to show. The dinner proceeded predictably, a ballet of numbers, market shares, and expansion strategies. Lysander dominated the conversation, his arrogance evident in every pronouncement. He spoke of aggressive takeovers, profit margins, and market capitalization with the unwavering conviction of a prophet. I remained silent, absorbing every detail, not just the words, but the unspoken tensions, the subtle power dynamics playing out around the linen tablecloth. I listened to the nuances of their interactions, the faint tremor in Lysander's voice when he spoke of the company's challenges, the way his eyes darted to Miss Albright seeking her approval. Beneath his bravado, I saw a thread of desperation, a man teetering on the edge of a precipice, trying to project strength while feeling weakness. I noticed the way Cassian Reed listened, his head slightly cocked, asking pointed, insightful questions that Lysander seemed to brush off, focused only on his own narrative. Then Mr. Sterling, a man whose condescension was almost palpable, finally turned his attention to me, a smirk playing on his lips, breaking the rhythm of the financial discourse. "So, Diana," he drawled, his tone dripping with thinly veiled disdain, "how does it feel to be privy to such weighty discussions, a bit out of your depth, perhaps?" His eyes narrowed clearly. Expecting a meek, self-effacing response, a humble retreat back into my invisible corner. That question, delivered with such thinly veiled disdain, was a turning point. In that moment, I could have retreated, become the invisible housekeeper he expected. But something snapped. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a quiet defiance, a sudden fierce urge to prove that I was more than just a silent accessory. I looked at Mr. Sterling, then at Lysander, who was watching me with a mixture of irritation and apprehension. This wasn't just about proving him wrong, it was about proving something to myself. The stage was set, and I knew with a certainty that surprised even me that I was about to speak. The air in the restaurant thickened with unspoken tension. Lysander's silence after my last comment was more potent than any outburst. He was seething. I could feel it, a palpable wave of controlled rage. I knew I had crossed a line he considered sacred, the line between the help and the masters. But the strange thing was I didn't regret it, not one bit. In fact, a quiet sense of triumph settled over me. I had spoken my truth, and it had landed. The consequences, well, I was ready for them. I knew this was the end of my time at the Thorne residence, but it felt less like a loss and more like a liberation. As the dinner wound down, a forced pleasantness descended upon the table, a thin veneer over the simmering resentment Lysander felt. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, and I, his supposed invisible accessory, had shattered that illusion. He hadn't forgotten my audacity, not for a second. With dessert plates being cleared, he seized his chance to publicly undermine me, to put me back in the box he'd always kept me in. "It's easy to pontificate on grand strategies, Diana," he said, his voice dripping with condescending sarcasm, a faint, unpleasant smirk playing on his lips, when one doesn't bear the weight of actual leadership decisions. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his gaze cold and challenging. "Don't you think you're speaking about something far beyond your understanding?" He expected me to shrink, to stammer, to confirm his unspoken assessment of my place. I met his gaze, my own eyes steady, unflinching. My heart was still hammering, but a calm determination had taken root. "Perhaps I don't know the weight of your leadership decisions, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. "But I understand their impact." I paused, allowing my words to sink in, letting their quiet power resonate. And sometimes those further from power see the consequences and the opportunities that those at the very top, blinded by their own perspective, simply cannot. My words were direct, unexpected, and carried a quiet authority that seemed to stun him into silence. The table held its breath. Then a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the tension. Cassian Reed let out an audible low laugh, a genuine burst of amusement and clear admiration for my courage and wit. Miss Albright, usually so stoic, offered a rare, almost imperceptible nod of approval, her eyes glinting with respect. Even Mr. Sterling, the skeptical one, looked thoughtful, his smirk replaced by a look of bewildered contemplation. The other investors exchanged approving glances, their initial judgment of me completely overturned. Lysander, however, fell silent, his face paling, a flush of humiliation creeping up his neck. He had utterly lost control of the situation, and more importantly, the narrative. The damage to his ego was devastatingly complete. When the dinner finally concluded, a swift and almost desperate affair for Lysander, he didn't wait for me. He strode out of the obsidian, his movements stiff and angry, leaving me to follow a clear public snub. Patrons in the lobby glanced whispering, sensing the unspoken drama, but I walked out with my head held high, a quiet dignity in my stride. I didn't need his company. I knew my voice was heard, my perspective valued, and that was what truly mattered to me. The cool New York night air felt liberating against my skin. The drive back to the penthouse in his luxury sedan was even more silent than the journey to the restaurant. The tension inside the car was thick, almost suffocating. I braced myself. I knew what was coming. Lysander dismissed the driver abruptly the moment we pulled into the building's underground garage, then stalked ahead, leaving me to navigate the labyrinthine service corridors alone. He was waiting for me in the vast, impersonal living room of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling behind him like mocking eyes. The moment I stepped through the grand double doors, he turned, his own eyes blazing with a raw mixture of frustration, contempt, and wounded pride. He didn't even wait for me to take a seat or offer a pretense of formality. "What were you thinking, Diana?" he roared, his voice low, but vibrating with suppressed fury. He slammed his hand against the polished surface of his minimalist coffee table. "I asked you to be discreet, not to become a spectacle." I remained remarkably calm despite the intensity of his anger, a surprising stillness settling over me. "I merely answered a question, Mr. Thorne." I stated, my voice controlled even. I expressed an opinion as any engaged individual might. He scoffed a derisive sound, his voice laced with pure contempt. "Opinion? You're a housekeeper, Diana. You're not paid to have opinions at my business dinners. You overstepped every boundary. You humiliated me." He started pacing his footsteps, echoing in the cavernous space. Then he stopped abruptly, turning to face me, his voice cold and final, a pronouncement rather than a statement. "Consider this your last day. You're fired." The words landed sharp and stinging. The injustice of it, the blatant disregard for my integrity, settled in my chest. But strangely, I didn't feel despair. I felt a quiet, fierce resolve. I refused to let his anger, his arrogance, break my composure. I simply nodded, maintaining my dignity, my gaze steady. I stood there for a moment, offering one last steady look at him, a look that conveyed understanding rather than anger, a silent acknowledgement of the man he was and the man he refused to be. Then I turned my back, not running, but walking away with purpose. I knew with absolute certainty that I would never have to endure his disdain again. Walking out of that penthouse for the last time into the cool New York night, I felt a strange lightness. It wasn't just the relief of escaping his suffocating arrogance. It was the profound realization that my worth wasn't tied to his approval or to any job title. That night I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed, a voice I had kept silent for too long. Being fired, though harsh, felt less like an ending and more like a violent, necessary shove towards a future I hadn't dared to dream of. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. The game had changed, and I was finally playing on my own terms. The city lights, which had once felt so indifferent now, seemed to sparkle with a promise of unknown possibilities. The air in the restaurant thickened with unspoken tension. Lysander's silence after my last comment was more potent than any outburst. He was seething. I could feel it, a palpable wave of controlled rage. I knew I had crossed a line he considered sacred, the line between the help and the masters. But the strange thing was, I didn't regret it, not one bit. In fact, a quiet sense of triumph settled over me. I had spoken my truth, and it had landed. The consequences, well, I was ready for them. I knew this was the end of my time at the Thorne residence, but it felt less like a loss and more like a liberation. As the dinner wound down, a forced pleasantness descended upon the table, a thin veneer over the simmering resentment Lysander felt. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, and I, his supposed invisible accessory, had shattered that illusion. He hadn't forgotten my audacity, not for a second. With dessert plates being cleared, he seized his chance to publicly undermine me, to put me back in the box he'd always kept me in. "It's easy to pontificate on grand strategies, Diana," he said, his voice dripping with condescending sarcasm, a faint, unpleasant smirk playing on his lips, "when one doesn't bear the weight of actual leadership decisions." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his gaze cold and challenging. "Don't you think you're speaking about something far beyond your understanding?" He expected me to shrink, to stammer, to confirm his unspoken assessment of my place. I met his gaze, my own eyes steady, unflinching. My heart was still hammering, but a calm determination had taken root. "Perhaps I don't know the weight of your leadership decisions, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. "But I understand their impact." I paused, allowing my words to sink in, letting their quiet power resonate. And sometimes those further from power see the consequences and the opportunities that those at the very top, blinded by their own perspective, simply cannot. My words were direct, unexpected, and carried a quiet authority that seemed to stun him into silence. The table held its breath. Then a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the tension. Cashin Reed let out an audible low laugh, a genuine burst of amusement and clear admiration for my courage and wit. Miss Albright, usually so stoic, offered a rare, almost imperceptible nod of approval, her eyes glinting with respect. Even Mr. Sterling, the skeptical one, looked thoughtful, his smirk replaced by a look of bewildered contemplation. The other investors exchanged approving glances, their initial judgment of me completely overturned. Lysander, however, fell silent, his face paling, a flush of humiliation creeping up his neck. He had utterly lost control of the situation, and more importantly, the narrative. The damage to his ego was devastatingly complete. When the dinner finally concluded, a swift and almost desperate affair for Lysander, he didn't wait for me. He strode out of the obsidian, his movements stiff and angry, leaving me to follow a clear public snub. Patrons in the lobby glanced, whispering, sensing the unspoken drama. But I walked out, with my head held high, a quiet dignity in my stride. I didn't need his company. I knew my voice was heard, my perspective valued, and that was what truly mattered to me. The cool New York night air felt liberating against my skin. The drive back to the penthouse in his luxury sedan was even more silent than the journey to the restaurant. The tension inside the car was thick, almost suffocating. I braced myself. I knew what was coming. Lysander dismissed the driver abruptly the moment we pulled into the building's underground garage, then stalked ahead, leaving me to navigate the labyrinthine service corridors alone. He was waiting for me in the vast, impersonal living room of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling behind him like mocking eyes. The moment I stepped through the grand double doors, he turned his own eyes blazing with a raw mixture of frustration, contempt, and wounded pride. He didn't even wait for me to take a seat or offer a pretense of formality. "What were you thinking, Diana?" He roared, his voice low but vibrating with suppressed fury. He slammed his hand against the polished surface of his minimalist coffee table. "I asked you to be discreet, not to become a spectacle." I remained remarkably calm, despite the intensity of his anger, a surprising stillness settling over me. "I merely answered a question, Mr. Thorne. I stated my voice controlled even. I expressed an opinion as any engaged individual might." He scoffed, a derisive sound, his voice laced with pure contempt. "Opinion? You're a housekeeper, Diana. You're not paid to have opinions at my business dinners. You overstepped every boundary. You humiliated me." He started pacing, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Then he stopped abruptly, turning to face me, his voice cold and final, a pronouncement rather than a statement. "Consider this your last day. You're fired." The words landed sharp and stinging. The injustice of it, the blatant disregard for my integrity, settled in my chest. But strangely, I didn't feel despair. I felt a quiet, fierce resolve. I refused to let his anger, his arrogance break my composure. I simply nodded, maintaining my dignity, my gaze steady. I stood there for a moment, offering one last steady look at him, a look that conveyed understanding rather than anger, a silent acknowledgement of the man he was and the man he refused to be. Then I turned my back, not running, but walking away with purpose. I knew with absolute certainty that I would never have to endure his disdain again. Walking out of that penthouse for the last time into the cool New York night, I felt a strange lightness. It wasn't just the relief of escaping his suffocating arrogance. It was the profound realization that my worth wasn't tied to his approval or to any job title. That night I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed, a voice I had kept silent for too long. Being fired, though harsh, felt less like an ending and more like a violent, necessary shove towards a future I hadn't dared to dream of. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. The game had changed, and I was finally playing on my own terms. The city lights, which had once felt so indifferent now, seemed to sparkle with a promise of unknown possibilities. The days immediately following my dismissal from Lysander Thorne's employment were a blur of practicalities and profound introspection. I packed my meager belongings from my small apartment in Queens, the one I'd afforded with my housekeeper's salary. There was a brief, unsettling quiet, a void where the familiar routine used to be. But instead of despair, I felt a strange sense of clarity. It was as if the universe had forcibly cleared the decks, demanding I finally navigate my own ship. I remember thinking, what now, Diana? What do you do when the safety net is gone, but the desire to fly is stronger than ever? The morning after being fired, the air in my small Queens apartment felt different. lighter somehow, despite the sting of injustice still lingering in my chest. Lysander's words, "You're fired," echoed, but they no longer held their icy power. Instead, they felt like a harsh final clap that closed one door, leaving a wide open, albeit terrifying emptiness. I spent the day simply processing, sifting through the raw emotions, the humiliation, the thrill of my defiance, and the stark, chilling uncertainty of my future. My options, I knew, were woefully limited. Housekeeping agencies, service industry jobs, they were all I had known, all I was qualified for. A deep sigh escaped me, a mix of apprehension and a nascent hope I still couldn't quite name. As I was packing my last few boxes, carefully folding my meager collection of books, my phone rang. The screen displayed an unknown number. My stomach tightened. Was it Lysander calling to retract or to gloat? Hesitantly, I answered my voice a cautious whisper. "Diana Frost," a warm, resonant voice asked from the other end. It was unmistakably Cassian Reed. My breath hitched. "Yes, this is Diana." I managed my voice firmer than I expected. He apologized for the abruptness of the call, then his tone shifted, becoming earnest, almost deferential. "I hope I'm not intruding. I just couldn't shake your insights from the other night, Diana. Your perspective, it was unlike anything I've heard in years." He paused, and I could practically hear his thoughtful smile. "Frankly, Lysander Thorne made a grave mistake letting you go. My company, Viridian Innovations, is based in Seattle, Washington, and we're looking for precisely the kind of mind you possess." My mind reeled. Seattle Viridian Innovations. What was he talking about? I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. Cassian continued, his voice calm and persuasive. He explained that he'd been looking for someone with my unique blend of observational skills, integrity, and unexpected insight qualities he believed were sorely lacking in the corporate world, which often prioritized data over human understanding. He didn't offer me a traditional administrative role. "We don't need another drone Diana," he said. "We need vision. I'm offering you a position as a strategic insights analyst." The title alone felt alien, too grand for someone who had spent her life polishing other people's grand illusions. "Strategic Insights Analyst," he repeated, as if sensing my disbelief. "It's a challenging role, yes, requiring independent thought and a willingness to challenge norms. You'd be analyzing market trends, consumer behavior, even internal company dynamics, but with a focus on the human element, your ability to observe, to see patterns others miss, to understand motivations. It's invaluable." I was overwhelmed. The offer was beyond anything I could have imagined. Me, a housekeeper, a strategic insights analyst, I questioned my own qualifications, my glaring lack of formal business education. "Mr. Reed, I don't have a business degree. My experience is quite different." I tried to explain, my voice trembling slightly, but Cassian's belief in me was unwavering. "Formal education teaches you what to think, Diana. Lived experience teaches you how to think. And a sharp mind like yours, coupled with that integrity you showed, that's precisely what I value. We can teach you the jargon. We can't teach genuine insight." The humiliation of Lysander's firing quickly transformed into the opportunity of a lifetime, a dizzying, terrifying chance at a new life. With a mix of surprise, fierce determination, and a healthy dose of trepidation, I found myself saying, "Yes, yes, Mr. Reed, I accept." The decision made, the monumental task of moving across the country began. The journey itself felt symbolic, each mile separating me from my old life in New York City, from the shadow of Lysander Thorne's penthouse, and propelling me toward the unknown. I watched the landscapes blur outside the plane window, the familiar concrete giving way to endless plains, then mountains, then the vast expanse of the Pacific. There was a potent blend of excitement and raw fear churning inside me. I found a small modern apartment in Seattle, a compact space with clean lines and large windows, a stark, refreshing contrast to the old-world grandeur and suffocating silence of Lysander's gilded cage. It felt like a fresh start, a canvas waiting to be painted. My initial days at Viridian Innovations in Seattle were a whirlwind, a sensory overload after years of quiet, meticulous routine. The company culture was vibrant, collaborative, and forward-thinking, a dizzying contrast to Lysander's rigid hierarchical empire. Meetings buzzed with creative energy, ideas flowed freely, and titles seemed less important than contributions. I met my new team, a diverse group of brilliant minds, including Orion, a data scientist with a cynical wit and an impressive, albeit initially skeptical, gaze. He looked at me with a questioning curiosity, clearly wondering how someone with my background landed such a role. I knew I had to prove myself not just to Cassian, but to everyone, and most importantly, to myself. Stepping off that plane in Seattle, the crisp, clean air felt like a baptism. I was no longer the invisible housekeeper. I was Diana Frost, Strategic Insights Analyst. The title still felt too grand, too foreign, like a borrowed suit. But as I walked through the bustling, innovative campus of Viridian Innovations, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't known I possessed. This wasn't just a new job. It was a new identity, a new chance, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Lysander Thorne, in his arrogant dismissal, had inadvertently opened the door to my true potential. He thought he was ending my career. He was actually launching it. The first few months at Viridian Innovations were a steep learning curve, a dizzying immersion into a world I'd only glimpsed from the periphery. I devoured every report, every presentation, every piece of data I could get my hands on. My lack of formal education was a glaring gap, but my years of meticulous observation of seeing patterns where others saw only clutter proved to be an unexpected asset. I remember the late nights fueled by coffee and an insatiable hunger to prove not just Cassian right, but myself. It wasn't about revenge on Lysander, not anymore. It was about proving my own capacity, my own worth, in a way I never had before. Life at Viridian Innovations in Seattle was a constant, exhilarating challenge. Every morning I arrived at the sleek, glass-paneled campus feeling a surge of energy. I immersed myself in every aspect of the company's operations, its unique approach to market strategy, its commitment to ethical practices, and its pioneering emphasis on social impact. I'd spend hours poring over internal documents, industry reports, and complex spreadsheets. My brain, accustomed to organizing and categorizing the physical world, adapted surprisingly well to the abstract world of data. I worked closely with Orion, a brilliant but initially cynical data scientist. He was a whirlwind of algorithms and dry humor, and at first his skepticism was palpable. He'd raise an eyebrow at my unconventional questions, which often focused on the human stories behind the market trends. "You're trying to find emotional data points, Diana," he'd quip, a sarcastic grin playing on his lips. But my sharp questions, rooted in years of observing subtle human behaviors, began to chip away at his cynicism. I'd ask, why would a consumer choose this over that, even if the price point is higher? What's the unspoken desire there? Questions that forced him to look beyond raw numbers. Gradually, through shared late nights and unexpected breakthroughs, I earned his respect. He even started calling me Frost, a term of grudging affection. Through this process, I discovered talents I never knew I had. My ability to connect disparate pieces of information, to identify underlying human motivations behind market trends, it wasn't something taught in business school. It was an intuitive leap, born from years of seeing patterns in Lysander's chaotic life, in the subtle shifts of his mood, in the hidden anxieties of the people around him. I could predict consumer reactions not just from demographic data, but from a gut feeling about what truly resonated with people. My insights, often rooted in my understanding of everyday people, proved invaluable. I'd propose a marketing campaign that seemed counterintuitive on paper, but resonated deeply with a specific demographic, proving far more successful than traditional approaches. Cassian Reed, with his visionary leadership, became my mentor, guiding me with a steady hand, challenging me with complex problems, and empowering me to take on more significant responsibilities. "Your insights are a breath of fresh air, Diana," he'd say, his eyes thoughtful. "You see the world and our customers with a clarity few others possess." I felt myself blossoming under his guidance, my confidence growing with each small victory. Meanwhile, almost like a parallel universe unfolding, news about Lysander Thorne's company in New York City trickled in. I didn't seek it out, but in the world of high finance, Bad news travels fast. Lysander's impulsive decisions, fueled by short-term gains and a deepening arrogance, were taking a brutal toll. I'd catch snippets on financial news channels. Thorn Industries loses key telecom contract. Partnership with Eurocorp dissolves amidst unprofessional conduct claims. His name, once synonymous with ruthless efficiency, was now whispered with a mix of pity and schadenfreude. The arrogance that had led to my dismissal was now costing him millions. Valuable partners were alienated. Key talent was jumping ship, and the company's once unblemished reputation was plummeting faster than a stone in water. I observed his self-inflicted wounds from afar, a grim satisfaction mingling with a strange, almost detached sense of pity. He was quite literally reaping what he had sown. Then came the meeting that would change everything. Viridian Innovations, under Cashin's visionary leadership, had quietly identified Lysander's struggling company, Thorn Industries, as a strategic acquisition target. Not for its rapidly dwindling current value, but for its underlying assets, its market position, its historical brand recognition assets that could be revitalized with a different, more ethical approach. Diana, now a trusted voice in Viridian's strategic planning, was brought into the confidential discussions. I provided critical insights into Lysander's weaknesses, his company's toxic internal culture, and the systemic issues that plagued it. This was invaluable intelligence for the acquisition strategy, a stark contrast to my previous life, where my intelligence was limited to knowing where Lysander left his dirty socks. The tide turned dramatically and with breathtaking speed. Viridian Innovations, moving with stealth and precision, quietly and strategically acquired a significant portion of Lysander's company's shares. It wasn't a hostile takeover, no dramatic public announcements or cutthroat maneuvers. It was a calculated, almost surgical move to stabilize a valuable, albeit mismanaged entity to prevent its complete collapse. My role, though, behind the scenes was crucial. I analyzed the human capital, the cultural aspects, foreseeing potential clashes, and identifying opportunities for a smoother integration. I was helping to rebuild what Lysander had so carelessly dismantled. The news of Viridian's acquisition of Thorn Industries felt surreal. It wasn't a moment of "I told you so," not outwardly anyway. It was a quiet affirmation of the universe's strange poetic justice. I was no longer just an observer. I was an active participant in shaping the future of a company that had once dismissed me as insignificant. The irony was profound. Lysander, in his hubris, had created the very vacuum that allowed me to rise. And now the path was set for our inevitable collision, not as housekeeper and employer, but as equals, or perhaps something more. The stage was being set for a confrontation I knew was coming, and for the first time I felt ready. I remember the day the email landed in my inbox, confirming the joint leadership meeting in Chicago. My name was on the attendee list, right alongside Lysander Thorn's. A chill ran down my spine, not of fear, but of anticipation. It had been nearly a year since I walked out of his penthouse, and in that time I had transformed. But had he? Or was he still the same arrogant titan, oblivious to the world beyond his own ego? I knew this wasn't just a business meeting. It was a reckoning, a moment to face the ghost of my past and affirm the woman I had become. The old Diana would have trembled. The new Diana felt a quiet, steely resolve. The conference room in Chicago, Illinois, was a gleaming tableau of corporate power. Executives from both Viridian Innovations and the newly acquired Thorn Industries milled about the air, buzzing with a mixture of polite introductions and unspoken tension. As a senior strategic insights analyst, I was a key representative for Viridian. My presence a clear testament to my pivotal role in the acquisition strategy. I sat confidently at the long, polished conference table next to Cassian, a quiet anchor amidst the pre-meeting chatter. Then the murmurs subsided. A collective hush fell over the room as the doors swung open and Lysander Thorn entered. His usual confident stride faltered almost immediately. His eyes, typically sharp and assessing, swept the room dismissively. At first, then, widened in disbelief. His face visibly paled as his gaze landed on me sitting there, poised and self-assured among the Viridian leaders. He hesitated, his body language screaming confusion, his eyes fixed on me in a mixture of dawning horror and utter incomprehension. The sheer impossibility of his former housekeeper being in such a position at this table clearly overwhelmed him. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, or perhaps a very inconvenient prophecy. I met his gaze directly. There was no resentment, no overt triumph in my eyes, only a serene, unwavering composure. For me, this moment wasn't about payback. It was about the validation of my journey and the opportunity to make a real difference in this newly merged entity. I offered him a polite professional nod, as if he were any other colleague, before subtly turning my attention back to the agenda. Let him be uncomfortable. My time for quiet submission was long past. The meeting proceeded. Lysander clearly rattled. He struggled to maintain his usual authoritative demeanor, his pronouncements lacking their former conviction. He made a few ill-advised comments revealing his fundamental lack of understanding of the new integrated strategy, a strategy that prioritized long-term sustainability and human capital over immediate aggressive profits. He clung to the old ways, the rigid structures that had ultimately led to his downfall. I, on the other hand, spoke with confidence, clarity, and a deep understanding of both companies' strengths and weaknesses, particularly regarding the human capital and social impact aspects. I highlighted areas where Thorn Industries had historically overlooked employee morale and community engagement, offering actionable insights for Viridian's new, more holistic approach. Cassian would often glance at me, a subtle nod of approval, confirming my contributions. After the meeting finally concluded, the room slowly emptied, leaving only a few key figures. Lysander, visibly shaken, his expression rigid and a muscle twitching in his jaw, approached me in the hallway. He looked as though he was still trying to reconcile the image of me polishing his silver with the woman who had just dissected his company's flaws with such clinical precision. "Diana," he muttered, his voice hoarse, struggling to maintain control, a hint of the old contempt still clinging to his tone. "So you're here, with them?" He gestured vaguely towards the retreating Viridian team. I stood firm, not letting his surprise or his thinly veiled disdain affect my calm demeanor. "Yes, Mr. Thorn," I replied, my voice even. "I am. And as you can see, our company acquired a significant stake in yours. We believe there's immense potential once it's properly aligned." I allowed myself a small, knowing smile. Lysander scoffed, a desperate attempt to mask his deep-seated insecurity with his familiar sneer. "This is ridiculous. Do you truly believe that just because you have a fancy title, you understand what real leadership is? This is just luck, a fluke." He tried to dismiss me, to shrink me back to the housekeeper he remembered. I crossed my arms, my gaze unwavering, meeting his furious eyes without a flicker. "That's the fundamental difference between us, Mr. Thorn." I stated, my voice quiet, but laced with an unshakable conviction. "I don't need you to respect me. I earned my place. It wasn't luck. You, on the other hand, are sinking because you never valued anything beyond yourself, your numbers, and your own inflated ego." I didn't raise my voice, but the words cut deeper than any shout. Lysander fell silent utterly, without a ready response, his face a mask of shock and wounded pride, the color draining from his face. The air crackled with the weight of my truth. His silence was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. In that moment, I saw not just the arrogant millionaire, but a man utterly exposed, stripped bare of his defenses. It wasn't a victory dance for me. It was a profound, almost melancholic realization of how far he had fallen and how much he had yet to learn. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something akin to responsibility for his future, not out of pity, but out of a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of our worlds. The game was no longer just about me. It was about the future of a company, and perhaps the redemption of a man. The confrontation with Lysander in Chicago left a strange imprint on me. It wasn't the triumphant moment I might have fantasized about in my quieter, angrier days. Instead, it was a stark, almost clinical observation of a man utterly lost in his own hubris. I remember the hollow look in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged after I spoke my truth. It was clear he was unraveling, and while a part of me felt a grim satisfaction, another more compassionate part recognized the immense pain of a man facing the wreckage of his own making. I knew instinctively that this wasn't the end of our story, but a new, more complex chapter was just beginning to unfold. After the Chicago meeting, Lysander Thorne returned to his New York City penthouse, a shell of his former self. The sprawling, opulent space, once the very symbol of his unassailable success, now felt empty, cold, and echoing with his recent humiliation. The sleek, polished surfaces seemed to mock him, reflecting back a man he barely recognized, a man defeated. For days he grappled with the devastating realization that everything he had built was crumbling, not due to external forces, but because of his own choices, his relentless arrogance, and his impulsive decisions. He spent hours in isolation, the grand windows offering a panoramic view of the city he once ruled, now a mocking reminder of his shrinking empire. My words delivered with quiet conviction haunted him, chipping away at the carefully constructed facade of his self-importance. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, and for the first time in his life, he acknowledged that the blame lay not with others, but solely with himself. Back in Seattle, I reflected on Lysander's reaction. I recounted the tense exchange to Cash and Reed over a late-night coffee in his office. He listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "It's difficult for someone like Lysander to self-reflect, Diana," Cassian said, swirling the last drops of coffee in his mug. "His entire identity is wrapped up in being invincible, being right. To admit fault is to shatter his world, but sometimes that's exactly what's needed for true growth." His nuanced perspective gave me pause. I began to realize that my role wasn't merely to win against him or to watch him fall. It was perhaps to potentially guide to show a different path if he was finally willing to see it. The thought was daunting, almost altruistic, and utterly unexpected. Days later, the summons came. An urgent board meeting in New York City convened by Miss Albright. Lysander and I were both called, the gravity of the situation palpable even across state lines. The financial situation of Thorne Industries was dire, a bleeding wound that threatened to consume what remained of the company. Miss Albright, her face grim, delivered a blunt ultimatum. Lysander had one last chance to convince the board he could lead and reverse the company's fortunes. The pressure on him was immense, a final suffocating weight. Lysander presented his plans. His voice strained a shadow of its former booming self. But his proposals were superficial, focused solely on immediate profits and aggressive expansion, echoing his old mistakes. There was no clear vision for long-term sustainability, no mention of social impact, no understanding of the fundamental shifts in the market. The investors exchanged skeptical looks, recognizing the same flawed patterns that had led to the current crisis. The air in the room grew heavy with their collective disillusionment. Lysander, in his desperation, was only digging himself deeper. Sensing the board's growing disillusionment, the unspoken dismissal hanging in the air, I knew I had to act. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the hundreds of employees, the reputation of a once great company, the potential for positive change. I stepped in, my voice calm but firm, cutting through the thick silence. "If I may, Miss Albright," I began, and she gestured for me to continue, her eyes holding a glimmer of hope. I articulated a comprehensive vision for Thorne Industries, emphasizing the need to reconnect the brand with its essential stakeholders, employees, customers, and the community. True value, particularly in today's market, isn't just in the quarterly report, I stated, my gaze sweeping across the faces of the board members. It's in trust, loyalty, and a shared purpose. I highlighted the critical importance of social responsibility, ethical practices, and a human-centric approach to business, drawing on Viridian's successful model. I proposed specific actionable steps for a sustainable recovery, including a significant investment in social projects in underserved communities, perhaps in rural Kentucky, where Viridian had already seen tremendous success. I spoke of rebuilding, not just restructuring, of fostering a culture of genuine connection. The investors were visibly interested, particularly Cassian Reed, who offered a subtle, encouraging nod, and Miss Albright, whose formidable expression softened slightly. They signaled for me to elaborate, listening intently as I spoke with confidence and conviction, painting a picture of a revitalized ethical Thorn Industries. Lysander watched utterly powerless as I, his former housekeeper, effectively saved his company with a vision he had always dismissed as irrelevant. He saw the admiration in their eyes for me and the stark, painful contrast to their palpable skepticism towards him. The irony was a bitter pill for him to swallow. When the meeting ended, the air still thick with the implications of my presentation, Lysander stopped me in the hallway. His voice was filled with disbelief, almost a plea, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Why are you doing this, Diana?" he muttered, his eyes searching mine. "Why would you help me save this company?" His question hung in the air, heavy with a mix of confusion and a nascent vulnerability I hadn't seen before. My answer wasn't about him, not really. It was about the company, about the people it affected, and about the principles I now live by. Because unlike you, Mr. Thorne, I told him, my voice soft but firm, I believe in the value of people. And more than that, I believe in a better future for this company with or without you. His silence after that was different. Not angry, not arrogant, but simply absorbing. For the first time I sensed a crack in the impenetrable armor of his pride. The true work, I realized, was just beginning. After the board meeting, a strange, uneasy truce settled between Lysander and me. He was still the CEO, but his authority had been implicitly curtailed, his power diluted. I, on the other hand, was now an undeniable force, his unexpected savior. I remember the almost physical tension in the room when we were together, a silent battle of wills that played out beneath the surface of polite corporate interactions. But beneath that tension, I began to sense a subtle shift in him, a flicker of something that resembled humility. It was like watching a glacier begin to melt, slow, almost imperceptible, but undeniably happening. Lysander returned to his sprawling New York City penthouse, a haunted man. My words, echoing in the cavernous silence of his once invincible domain, were relentless. He felt judged, exposed, and deeply, fiercely resentful of my constant presence as a mirror to his colossal failures. He paced his polished floors, staring out at the city lights, the grand view now a mocking tableau of his crumbling empire. Yet beneath the anger, a foreign sensation began to stir, the raw, uncomfortable desire to change, to prove himself not just to the board, but to me. This nascent urge to change began to war with his ingrained arrogance, a brutal internal battle he'd never fought before. He started to reflect on his past decisions, truly reflect, seeing the direct consequences of his hubris. The thought was a bitter pill, but one he was finally agonizingly swallowing. A crucial follow-up meeting with the Board of Investors was scheduled in New York City a week later to finalize the recovery plan. The financial situation of Thorn Industries remained perilously fragile, a patient on life support. Lysander was determined to demonstrate his leadership, to claw back some semblance of his former control, and perhaps to prove to Diana that he could still be trusted with the reins. The stakes were higher than ever. I arrived early deliberately at the New York City boardroom. The air was already thick with the scent of ambition and stale coffee. I meticulously prepared the presentation for the joint proposal, the one that incorporated my human-centric vision for the company's future. Every slide, every data point was carefully curated to emphasize long-term sustainability and ethical growth. I anticipated Lysander's likely attempts to reassert his dominance, to hijack the narrative, and I prepared myself for the inevitable clash. My composure was my shield, my conviction my sword. Lysander, true to form, had indeed prepared a bold parallel speech. It was a last-ditch effort to impress the board with his aggressive expansion plans, crafted without a single consultation with me, or more shockingly, with the board itself. He believed this would demonstrate his unwavering leadership, his unshakable belief in the old ways, the ones that had always brought him power. He looked to me like a drowning man grasping for a familiar but ultimately useless life raft. During the meeting, as I presented my stable, sustainable growth plan, emphasizing community engagement and employee well-being, Lysander interrupted me, his voice abruptly cutting across mine, sharp with impatience. He advocated fiercely for his risky, rapid expansion strategy, a rehash of his previous failures. The company needs visibility, he boomed, his old bravado momentarily resurfacing. It needs results, immediate results, not some slow-burn, touchy-feely social project. He argued that the market wouldn't wait for gradual change, echoing his old profit-driven mantra. I met his interruption with a calm that belied the surge of frustration within me. With all due respect, Mr. Thorne, I countered, my voice firm but steady. That very approach led us to this precarious position. Consistency, sustainability, and a clear mission that resonates with our stakeholders are far more valuable than rapid, ego-driven growth. I looked directly at Miss Albright, then at Cassian Reed, emphasizing my point. The market values trust, not just quarterly spikes, and trust is built through a commitment to more than just the bottom line. The board was visibly divided, their gazes shifting between us, but many leaned towards my pragmatic, grounded approach. The whispers of approval for my insights were unmistakable. Miss Albright, recognizing the impasse, intervened, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Gentlemen, Miss Frost," she said, her gaze firm. "It's clear we have two distinct visions. However, the company's future demands a unified front." She paused, her eyes settling on Lysander with an unyielding resolve. "Mr. Thorne, Miss Frost, you will present a joint proposal at our next meeting. I expect a single cohesive strategy. This means collaboration." Lysander's face tightened. He had lost the battle, realizing perhaps for the first time that he was no longer in sole control. The power had irrevocably shifted. That night, back in his New York City office, the city lights reflecting coldly off the glass, Lysander reviewed financial reports, a growing desperation gnawing at him. He needed a breakthrough, a win, something to prove his continued relevance. His phone buzzed, a message from an old shady contact, a businessman, Marcus Thorne, willing to invest a significant amount in Thorne Industries, no questions asked. The catch, a small say in the company's social projects, a seemingly innocuous request. For Lysander, this seemed like a convenient, almost miraculous solution, quick investment, a way to show Diana he could also act for the good of the company. Without her constant judging presence, he could still be the hero. Without consulting me, without consulting the board, Lysander impulsively scheduled a meeting. Within hours, fueled by a desperate need for a win, he signed an initial contract, feeling a rush of triumphant vindication. He had solved the problem his way. When I heard about Lysander's secret deal, a hushed phone call from a concerned Bethany, a wave of disappointment washed over me. It wasn't just frustration, it was a deep weariness that settled heavy in my bones. I had hoped he was turning a corner, that the glimmer of humility I'd sensed was real. But this impulsive, self-serving act was a stark reminder of his ingrained patterns, his inability to truly collaborate, to genuinely prioritize anything beyond his own immediate gratification. It felt like a betrayal, not just to me, but to the very principles we were trying to instill for the company's future. I knew then that words weren't enough. He needed to feel the consequences, to truly understand the impact of his actions beyond the numbers on a spreadsheet. And I knew with a heavy heart that our most difficult conversation was yet to come. His pride, I realized, was still his heaviest burden. The moment I heard about Lysander's secret deal, a cold certainty settled in my gut. It wasn't just a misstep. It was a deliberate circumvention, a desperate grasp for control that threatened to unravel everything we'd fought for. I remember the surge of adrenaline, the quiet fury that propelled me straight to his office. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about drawing a line in the sand, a line he desperately needed to see. I knew this conversation would be ugly, but it was necessary. He needed to understand that leadership wasn't about grand gestures or secret deals, but about integrity and transparency, especially when the stakes were so high. I walked straight from my connecting flight, my resolve hardening with every step toward his penthouse in New York City. The familiar opulence now felt suffocating, a gilded cage built by hubris. I found Lysander in his grand office, his back to me, engaged in a video call. His voice, usually so controlled, was animated, almost giddy, as he excitedly discussed expansion plans with a man whose face was obscured, but whose reputation I already knew from Bethany's worried whispers, a shady financier notorious for his predatory deals. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold air conditioning, but from the dread of what he had done. The moment he turned, catching sight of me standing in the doorway, a look of pure, unadulterated shock drained the color from his face. He knew. He was caught. He fumbled to end the call, muttering a hasty goodbye. The screen went black, plunging the room into an uneasy silence. I remained rooted to the spot, arms crossed, my disappointment evident in every rigid line of my body. "You made a deal without the board's approval?" I asked, my voice low sharp, with indignation cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "How could you do that, Lysander?" He took a deep breath, visibly preparing for the argument, a practiced defense already forming on his lips. "It was an opportunity, Diana," he began, his voice regaining some of its old bluster, though a defensive edge remained. "A necessary investment. We needed it for expansion. I was trying to save the company just like you." He gestured vaguely, as if equating his impulsive secret deal with my weeks of meticulous collaborative work. I shook my head slowly, disbelief warring with a profound weariness. "Save the company, Lysander. Don't you realize how risky this is? This investor now has a say in our social project decisions. What happens when he starts wanting to shape everything to his own interests? What about the people we promised to help in rural Kentucky, the communities we committed to supporting?" My voice rose slightly, the emotion I'd tried to suppress breaking through. He attempted to regain control to diminish my concerns. "It's a calculated risk, Diana," he insisted, though his eyes darted away, betraying his unease. "He only wants a small share, a percentage of the profits from those projects. It's negligible." I narrowed my eyes, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And what happened to the commitment to value people, to act with transparency? This isn't the type of leadership we promised to build. This is the same old arrogance, just repackaged into something you thought would look like a solution." My words hit him hard, stripping away his carefully constructed justifications. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and the deep-seated resentment he carried towards my constant judgment flared. "Why are you always expecting me to fail, Diana?" He snapped, a rare, raw crack in his facade. His voice was laced with genuine pain, almost a plea. "I'm trying. I want to do what's right." My gaze softened slightly. I saw not just the arrogant CEO, but the scared, lonely man beneath. But my tone remained firm, unwavering. "It's not about wanting you to fail, Lysander. It's about you understanding the impact of your actions. Leadership isn't just about making grand decisions. It's about responsibility and integrity. Acting in secret, circumventing the very board meant to guide you, only confirms that you still don't get that." He looked away, turning to stare out the vast windows at the glittering city, feeling the full, crushing weight of my words. The silence stretched, heavy with his unspoken defeat. Maybe I'll never understand it the way you want, Diana." He muttered, a rare admission of weakness, a flicker of genuine humility I hadn't thought him capable of. I nodded slowly, a profound sadness settling over me. "Maybe, but until you do, you'll just keep breaking the same promises you made, and believe me, that's a responsibility that can become too heavy to bear." I left him standing there, bathed in the cold light of the city, utterly alone. 2 weeks later, the board reconvened in New York City to discuss Lysander's unauthorized deal. The air in the boardroom was tense, thick with disappointment. The board members were deeply concerned, their faces grim, as Lysander attempted to explain his decision, his voice lacking conviction. I expressed my objections clearly, outlining the potential ethical pitfalls and the long-term damage to the company's mission. Miss Albright, her expression stern, reminded Lysander that the company's newfound social purpose, the very thing that made it attractive for acquisition, could not be compromised by reckless, self-serving deals. After a lengthy, heated discussion, the board made its decision they would reassess Lysander's position, considering significantly reducing his authority over future strategic decisions. He left the room in silence, utterly defeated, the shadow of his former power now a ghost. That day, I saw the last vestiges of Lysander's old self crumble. He wasn't angry anymore. He was simply broken. It was a difficult sight to watch someone lose so much, even someone who had caused me pain. But in that moment of his defeat, I saw a tiny flicker of something new, a nascent understanding in his eyes. He had always believed leadership was about power and control. Now, stripped of both, he was finally beginning to grasp that true leadership might require something far more profound: humility and a willingness to serve. The path ahead for him would be arduous, fraught with the challenges of rebuilding not just a company, but himself. But for the first time, I felt a sliver of hope that he might actually walk it. The days following the board's decision were a strange blend of quiet and profound change. Lysander was a ghost in the New York City office, his usual booming presence replaced by a somber silence. I remember feeling a deep sense of responsibility not just for the company, but for him. It wasn't about pity. It was about the potential for growth I now saw, however faint. I knew that true change wasn't about a single grand gesture, but a painstaking day-by-day commitment. And I realized that my role unexpectedly had shifted from adversary to reluctant guide. It was a burden, but also, surprisingly, a privilege. Lysander reached his lowest point in the lonely grandeur of his New York City penthouse. The vast, empty rooms once filled with the echoes of his ambition now amplified his despair. He confronted the wreckage of his life and career, the raw truth undeniable. His failure stemmed not from external factors, but from his own selfishness, his insatiable need for immediate gratification. He saw how his arrogance had driven away not just business partners and employees, but also the few family members who had tried to stay close. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly analyze his decisions, dissecting them with a brutal honesty he had never dared before. The mirror he faced reflected a man he barely recognized, a man stripped bare of all his defenses. In the late afternoon, during a lull in my follow-up meetings in New York City, I found myself walking down the familiar corridor to Lysander's office. I didn't know why I was going, only that something compelled me. When I appeared at his door, my expression was serious, but for the first time, it was devoid of the coldness and judgment I once held for him. I sensed his vulnerability, a raw, exposed wound. He sat slumped at his desk, staring blankly out at the city skyline, a figure of profound defeat. He looked up, startled, then his shoulders sagged. Tired of the endless disputes of fighting against a truth he could no longer deny, Lysander decided to be truly honest. "Diana," he began, his voice hesitant, raw, almost unrecognizable, I know I've made many mistakes. My decisions have affected people beyond what I can repair." He finally met my gaze, his eyes clouded with regret. "And I understand if you think it's not worth trying anymore." I listened in silence, my heart aching with a complex mix of emotions. When he finished, I spoke, my tone softer than he had ever heard from me. "It's a start, Lysander." I nodded slowly. "But recognizing mistakes isn't enough. What do you plan to do about it?" He admitted, his voice barely a whisper, that he didn't know, only that he couldn't continue the same way. The old path was scorched earth. I nodded again. "True change is practiced every day. It's not a single grand revelation. It's 1,000 small choices. You need to learn to listen, to understand that leading isn't about always being in control, but about serving. Are you willing to do that?" Lysander swallowed hard, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining a fragile conviction. "I'm willing." but I don't know if I can do it alone." I offered him a half smile, a faint curve of my lips. "No one can, Lysander. That's why true leadership is done in partnership with trust. You need to trust people. You need to know you can't do everything alone." The next morning, I took the first step, a calculated risk. I took Lysander to his first social project as part of the company's recovery commitment. It was located in a struggling community in rural Kentucky, a place far removed from the polished boardrooms and luxury penthouses he inhabited. The project focused on empowering women in vulnerable situations to enter the workforce, providing training, childcare, and a sense of community. For Lysander, accustomed to opulence, the humble environment felt uncomfortably real, stripped bare of all pretense. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and honest labor, was a stark contrast to the sterile air of his office. We sat in a small, brightly lit room amidst women who had known hardship he could barely imagine. As he listened to their stories, Maya, a single mother, who found hope through the program after fleeing an abusive relationship, Clara, an older woman re-entering the workforce after a lifetime of raising children, he began to feel the profound impact of each one. This wasn't about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about real lives, real struggles, real triumphs. I watched his face subtly softening, his usual dismissive gaze replaced by something akin to awe, and then humility. An elderly lady with kind, weathered eyes, Silas approached him after the session. Her voice was gentle but carried the weight of experience. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "my son worked for you years ago in your New York office. He was fired suddenly without explanation. It devastated him." She paused, her gaze steady, not accusing, but simply stating a fact. "He never recovered truly." Lysander was deeply shaken, his face paling. He remembered the dismissal, a brief, impersonal directive he'd given to Bethany without a second thought, without a single glance at the file. Now the human cost of his thoughtless actions crashed down on him. He felt small, exposed, finally understanding the true value of people I had spoken of. Back at his New York City office, still shaken from the experience, Lysander found me. His usual rigid posture was softened, his eyes holding a vulnerability I had never witnessed before. "Today," he said, his voice low, filled with a newfound sincerity, "I truly understood what you meant, Diana, about people, about impact." He offered me a hesitant, almost fragile smile. I looked at him, my eyes now holding only understanding, no trace of the coldness or triumph. "This is just the beginning, Lysander," I told him gently. "Change takes time and consistent action, but maybe over time you'll start to understand that to lead is to serve." The path ahead was long, but for the first time I felt a flicker of genuine hope. Watching Lysander in that rural Kentucky community stripped of his usual corporate armor was like witnessing a transformation in slow motion. The arrogance was replaced by a raw vulnerability, the dismissiveness by a genuine, if awkward, empathy. He was finally seeing the world not through the lens of profit margins, but through the eyes of the people his decisions affected. It was a difficult, messy process, but it was real. And in that moment, I realized that my initial anger had softened into something far more complex, a quiet hope for his redemption, and a deeper understanding of the profound impact one person can have, not just on a company, but on a soul. The journey of transformation for both Lysander and Thorne Industries was long and arduous. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a series of small, deliberate steps, often fraught with setbacks. I remember the countless meetings, the late-night discussions, the moments of frustration when Lysander would revert to old habits only to pull himself back. But what truly defined this period was his unwavering commitment, a stubbornness that for once was channeled towards something truly meaningful. It was a testament to the idea that even the most entrenched patterns can be broken, and that true leadership is a continuous act of learning and serving. Weeks later, after the board's decisive action, I encouraged Lysander to attend a meeting with the social project team in New York City. This was a team he had always delegated to, always neglected, seeing their work as a mere footnote to his grand financial ambitions. He entered the vibrant, collaborative meeting room, and for the first time I saw him truly feel the weight of their distrust, their unspoken expectation. He hesitated, his usual confident swagger replaced by a tentative uncertainty. Instead of immediately taking charge, he chose to listen rather than speak, a significant, almost revolutionary shift for him. The meeting began with testimonies from team members. Mark, a young, idealistic project manager, spoke passionately about the challenges they faced due to a historical lack of resources and the constant pressure for quick, superficial results. He emphasized the profound need for consistency and long-term commitment for the people in rural Kentucky who relied on their programs. Lysander listened intently, his gaze fixed on Mark, absorbing the profound impact of his past decisions, finally wanting to understand others' perspectives, not just impose his own. I watched him, a quiet hope beginning to bloom in my chest. Inspired by what he heard, Lysander decided to get directly involved in the project, not as a leader barking orders, but as a learner. He accompanied me on more visits to the communities we served, shedding his designer suits for practical work clothes and foregoing his private jet for commercial flights. He saw firsthand how his past decisions affected people at the most basic level, the families struggling to pay bills, the individuals yearning for purpose. He met more individuals, like Julia, a young mother, whose life was transformed by the training program, her gratitude shining in her eyes. Each personal story solidified his understanding that true results were in individual transformations, in the tangible uplift of human lives, not just in abstract numbers on a quarterly report. Back at his New York City office after weeks of direct involvement, Lysander found me. His tone was no longer arrogant, no longer defensive, but serious and remarkably determined. "You were right, Diana," he said, his voice sincere, devoid of its usual bluster. "I always treated this as a tool for expansion, something to improve my image, to appease critics. But now I see my vision was completely wrong. It was incredibly shallow." He looked at me, his eyes earnest, vulnerable. "I want to learn. I want to do this the right way, to truly serve and see the real impact of what we're building. I want every person involved in these projects to find something I never had: true leadership based on genuine purpose." I watched him, a quiet astonishment, mingling with a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time, I saw the true sincerity in his gaze, an authentic desire to change. "Then start showing that, Lysander," I challenged gently, a slight smile playing on my lips. "In every decision, in every conversation, in every interaction. Prove to all of us, not just with words, but with actions, that you can change." In the following weeks and months, Lysander embraced his transformation with a fervor that surprised everyone, including himself. He became an ardent champion of the social projects, reallocating substantial resources, not as a reluctant duty, but as a passionate mission. He fostered a culture of transparency and empathy within Thorne Industries, actively seeking feedback from all levels of staff, a truly revolutionary concept for him. The company, now thriving as a joint venture with Viridian, began to flourish not just financially, but ethically, its reputation slowly but surely being rebuilt on a foundation of integrity. At a final board meeting in New York City a year later, Lysander, with me by his side, presented a new comprehensive vision for the company. His presentation was no longer about ego or aggressive numbers, but about shared purpose, sustainable growth, and profound human impact. He spoke with genuine conviction, demonstrating a profound understanding of the principles I had championed for so long. The board, including a visibly impressed Miss Albright and a proudly smiling Cashin Reed, offered him a standing ovation, a gesture that would have once fueled his arrogance, but now brought a genuine humble flush to his face. Lysander and I, once adversaries, now worked as a formidable partnership. I, now a key executive at the combined entity, continued to provide strategic insights, ensuring the human element remained at the core of every decision. Lysander, no longer the arrogant millionaire, had become a respected leader, known not just for his business acumen, but for his integrity and his unwavering commitment to social responsibility. He had truly become a man reborn. Sometimes life throws you a curveball a moment that seems like a disaster, but turns out to be the catalyst for everything that follows. Being fired by Lysander Thorne was that moment for me. It forced me to find my voice, to discover my capabilities, and to step into a life I never dared to imagine. And in a strange twist of fate, it also set Lysander on a path he desperately needed to walk. I look back now, not with bitterness, but with a profound sense of gratitude. The millionaire took his housekeeper to a business dinner, and what she did shocked everyone. But what he did eventually shocked me even more. He changed. And in doing so, he taught me that true leadership isn't about power, but about the courage to evolve, to serve, and to finally see the invaluable worth in every single person, including yourself. It was, after all, a true story, and it was mine. What started as a shocking moment at a dinner table evolved into something so much more profound. Elara's journey wasn't just about proving someone wrong. It was about proving herself right, about embracing integrity and redefining what true success looks like. And Lysander's fall wasn't the end, but a painful, necessary push towards becoming a leader who finally understands the power of humility and service. Their story reminds us that life's biggest challenges often lead to our greatest transformations. It's about finding your voice even when it trembles, and understanding that true influence comes from impact, not just power. So what's your take on Elara and Lysander's incredible journey? What lessons resonated most with you? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If you were moved by this true story, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more tales that ignite the spirit.